You'll just waste that 5 million alone, Mom. Those words hit me like a slap across the face in that quiet Chicago cafe, delivered by my own daughter with the casual cruelty of someone discussing the weather. The silence that followed felt like drowning. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, just please leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me continue opening up about this. My name is Eleanor Whitman, and I'm 73 years old. I live in a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street in Evanston, Illinois, the same house where I raised 3 children, nursed my late husband through cancer, and spent 47 years believing that family meant everything. The wallpaper in the hallway still bears the pencil marks where I measured my children's heights every birthday, each line a memory of hope and unconditional love. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I woke at 6:30, made my coffee in the same blue ceramic mug my daughter Sarah had given me for Mother's Day 15 years ago, back when her gifts came with handwritten cards instead of calculated requests for money. The steam rose from the cup as I sat at my kitchen table, watching the neighbor's golden retriever chase squirrels in the yard next door, the same simple pleasure I'd enjoyed for decades. I wore my favorite cardigan, the soft gray one with pearl buttons that my husband Richard had bought me for our 30th anniversary. He said it made my eyes look like storm clouds, beautiful and mysterious. I'd kept it pristine all these years, treating it like armor against a world that had grown increasingly cold since his passing. My phone buzzed against the wooden table. A text from Sarah. Coffee at Rosebud Cafe. 11 a.m. We need to discuss your situation. My situation. Not, how are you feeling, Mom? Or, want to catch up. Just, my situation. I should have known then. The signs had been there for months, maybe years. But I'd been too blinded by maternal love to see them clearly. The way Sarah's visits always coincided with her financial emergencies. How my son Michael only called when he needed help with his mortgage or his daughter's college tuition. The way my youngest, Thomas, had moved across the country to Seattle, claiming his marketing job required it, but somehow never had time for more than obligatory holiday phone calls. I arrived at Rosebud Cafe 15 minutes early, as I always did. The familiar scent of cinnamon rolls and freshly ground coffee beans filled the air, mixing with the gentle hum of conversations from other patrons, couples planning weekend trips, friends catching up over lattes, grandmothers like me who still believed in the sanctity of shared meals and genuine connection. I chose our usual table by the window, the one where sunlight filtered through vintage lace curtains and cast dancing shadows across the checkered tablecloth. This cafe had been our place for years, where Sarah used to bring her children when they were small, where we'd laughed over sticky fingers and spilled juice, where I'd listened to her dreams and fears with the patience only a mother could possess. Sarah walked in exactly at 11, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her right to take up space in the world. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless despite claiming she'd had a rough morning. She wore a coat I'd never seen before, camel-colored wool that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She didn't hug me. She didn't smile. She simply removed her coat with the mechanical precision of someone conducting business, then sat across from me with the kind of focused intensity I'd seen her use in boardroom negotiations at her real estate firm. "Mom," she began, not bothering with pleasantries, "we need to talk about your finances." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. Not, "How are you?" or, "I've missed you." Just straight to the money. I blinked, my coffee cup frozen halfway to my lips. "What about my finances?" Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to the tone she used when explaining complex real estate deals to clients she considered intellectually inferior. "Dad left you well off. Very well off. The insurance money, the house equity, his retirement accounts, your own savings. We're talking about nearly $5 million. $5 million? She said it like an accusation. "You're living like a church mouse in that old house," she continued, her eyes scanning my cardigan with barely concealed disappointment. "You drive a 15-year-old Honda. You clip coupons. You eat tuna sandwiches for dinner. What's the point of having money if you're going to waste it?" Waste it? The word stung more than she could have intended. Every dollar Richard and I had saved came from sacrifice. Skipped vacations so the children could have piano lessons. secondhand clothes so they could attend better schools, countless small denials of our own desires so their futures could be secure. "I'm not wasting anything," I said quietly, my voice barely audible above the cafe's ambient noise. "I'm being careful." "That money is for emergencies, for what?" Sarah interrupted, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and glanced around the cafe. "You're 73 years old, Mom. How many emergencies are you planning for? How many years do you think you have left to enjoy life?" The cruelty was so casual, so matter-of-fact, that it took my breath away. "How many years do you think you have left?" As if my mortality was just another inconvenient variable in her financial calculations. She pulled out her phone and showed me what looked like a real estate listing. "Michael and I have been talking. We found this beautiful assisted living community in Naperville. It's got everything: meal plans, activities, medical care on site. You'd love it." I stared at the screen, seeing pristine hallways and manufactured cheerfulness, common rooms designed to warehouse the elderly with dignity and efficiency. "I don't want to move to assisted living. I want to stay in my home." "But that's just it, Mom. You don't need that big house anymore. You could sell it. Use that money plus a portion of Dad's life insurance to secure a spot at Sunset Manor. The waiting list is usually 2 years, but Michael knows someone on the board." Of course he did. My children had become experts at networking their way around obstacles, except when it came to their own mother's wishes. "And the rest of the money?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Sarah's expression shifted, revealing the calculation that had been lurking beneath her concern. "Well, that's what we need to discuss. The 3 of us, Michael, Thomas, and I, we think it makes sense to set up some transfers now. For tax purposes. Estate planning." She said it so smoothly, as if she'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times. As if my children had been meeting without me, discussing my future like I was an asset to be managed rather than a human being with her own desires and autonomy. "You mean you want me to give you my money now instead of leaving it to you when I die?" The bluntness of my words seemed to catch her off guard, but only for a moment. "It's not like that, Mom. It's smart financial planning. You could watch us enjoy it instead of having it tied up in probate later." "Wouldn't that make you happy?" "Wouldn't that make me happy?" The question revealed everything about how Sarah saw our relationship, a transaction where my happiness derived from their financial benefit, where my purpose was to fund their comfort rather than live my own life on my own terms. I thought about the envelope hidden in my bedroom drawer, the one containing Richard's final letter to me. He'd written it during his last weeks, when the cancer had made speaking difficult, but his mind remained sharp. "Eleanor," it said, "don't let anyone make you feel guilty for existing. You've given enough. Save some life for yourself." I'd read those words 100 times, but I'd never truly understood them until this moment, sitting across from my daughter as she calmly explained why my continued independence was an inconvenience to be managed. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, Sarah painting pictures of family financial security and my peaceful golden years in institutional care. She spoke about her children's college funds, Michael's expanding business needs, Thomas's struggles with his mortgage after his divorce. All valid concerns, all problems that money could solve. My money. When I finally left the cafe, my hands were shaking as I unlocked my Honda. Not from age or infirmity, but from the slow dawning realization that the people I'd sacrificed everything for now saw me as nothing more than an obstacle between them and financial security. That afternoon, I sat in Richard's old armchair and began to remember. Not the pleasant memories I usually indulged in, but the uncomfortable truths I'd been avoiding. The way Sarah had handled Richard's funeral arrangements like a business merger, making decisions about flowers and music without consulting me. How Michael had suggested selling the house while the market was hot just 3 months after his father's death. The way Thomas had asked about his inheritance during Richard's wake. I'd been so grateful for their involvement, so relieved not to handle everything alone, that I'd missed the signs of their true priorities. As evening fell and the house grew quiet, I understood with painful clarity that my children hadn't just inherited Richard's financial legacy. They'd begun collecting on it while I was still alive. The phone didn't ring that night. No one called to ask how I was feeling, whether I was lonely, if I needed anything beyond financial planning. I sat in the growing darkness, surrounded by family photographs that suddenly felt like evidence of a life I'd imagined rather than actually lived. And for the first time since Richard's death, I began to wonder, what would happen if I stopped being the mother they expected me to be and started being the woman I'd forgotten I could become? That night, sleep eluded me completely. I found myself standing in my hallway at 3 in the morning, staring at the family photo gallery that stretched from the front door to the kitchen. 37 framed memories of birthdays, graduations, holidays, and milestones that I'd documented with the devotion of a museum curator. But now, in the harsh fluorescent light I'd switched on, these images felt different, like evidence in a case I'd been too blind to recognize I was building against myself. There was Sarah at 16, grinning beside her first car, a used Honda Civic I'd bought her after working double shifts at the hospital for 6 months. I remembered how she'd hugged me that day, tears streaming down her face, promising she'd never forget what I'd done for her. The next week, she'd complained to her friends that it wasn't the BMW her classmates drove. Michael's college graduation photo hung next to it. His proud smile captured moments after receiving his business degree from Northwestern University. $43,000 in tuition and living expenses, paid from the savings account Richard and I had meticulously built over 20 years. We'd eaten pasta and store-brand groceries for months to make those payments, telling ourselves it was an investment in his future. He'd landed a 6-figure job immediately after graduation and celebrated by taking his girlfriend to Europe, a trip that cost more than we'd spent on food that entire year. Thomas's wedding picture occupied the corner spot, beaming in his rented tuxedo as he stood beside his now ex-wife Jennifer. I'd paid for the reception when they'd run over budget on their dream venue. $8,000 that represented every penny of the vacation fund Richard and I had been saving for our postponed anniversary trip to Ireland. We never did make it to Ireland. Richard's diagnosis came 2 years later, and by then, travel had become impossible. I pulled the photo down and held it closer to the light, studying my own face in the background, radiant with pride, completely unaware that I was documenting my own systematic erasure from my children's financial consciousness. Walking into the kitchen, I opened the drawer where I kept my checkbook and began the accounting I should have done years ago. Bank statements, receipts, loan documents, all the paper trail of a mother who'd given until giving became reflexive rather than generous. Sarah's first house down payment, $18,000. Withdrawn from our retirement fund in 2018, she'd promised to pay it back once the real estate market stabilized. The market had been stable for 3 years now. Michael's business startup loan, $25,000 given when his bank application was denied. Just until I get established, Mom. This is going to change everything for our family. His business was thriving now, but somehow the loan had never been mentioned again. Thomas's divorce attorney fees, $12,000 because Jennifer was trying to take everything, and he needed to protect the kids' future. Those same grandchildren I saw twice a year if I was lucky, and only when Thomas needed something. Car repairs, emergency medical bills, back-to-school shopping sprees, vacation deposits they couldn't afford. The list stretched across 4 pages of careful handwriting, each entry representing a moment when I'd chosen their immediate needs over my own long-term security. The total was staggering, over $200,000 in direct transfers, loans, and gifts over the past 8 years. Enough to buy a house, enough to travel the world, enough to secure my own independence instead of funding theirs. But it wasn't just the money. It was everything else I'd given without accounting for the cost. I remembered the year Sarah had called, sobbing, because her babysitter had quit during her busiest season at work. Without hesitation, I'd rearranged my entire life, driving 40 minutes each way to watch 4-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Jackson 3 days a week for 7 months. I'd planned activities, cooked their favorite meals, helped with homework, and loved them with the intensity only grandmothers possess. When Sarah finally found a new babysitter, she'd handed me a gift card to Target and said, "Thanks, Mom. You're a lifesaver." $25 for 7 months of full-time childcare. I'd calculated it once. If I'd charged even minimum wage, Sarah would have owed me over $4,000. Instead, I'd paid for the gas to get there. The irony wasn't lost on me that these same grandchildren now barely acknowledged my presence at family gatherings, too absorbed in their devices to engage with the grandmother who'd sung them lullabies and kissed their scraped knees when their parents were too busy building careers to notice their tears. Then, there was Michael's crisis 3 years ago, when his wife Lisa had been hospitalized with complications during her second pregnancy. He'd called me at midnight, panicking about who would care for 5-year-old Tyler while he stayed at the hospital. I'd driven through a snowstorm to reach their house, then lived in their guest room for 2 weeks, maintaining Tyler's routine while the adults dealt with medical emergencies. I'd cooked meals, done laundry, attended parent-teacher conferences, and provided the stability that kept their household functioning during the scariest time of their lives. When Lisa recovered and life returned to normal, Michael had shaken my hand at the door like I was a helpful contractor, rather than his mother who'd dropped everything to hold his family together. "We really appreciate everything you did," he'd said, already checking his phone for work emails. "Lisa's mom is coming next week to help out, so we should be all set." I'd driven home through clearer skies, realizing that my usefulness had expired the moment their preferred help became available. The pattern was so consistent it felt choreographed. Crisis, desperation, my immediate response, their relief, then silence. Until the next emergency arose and suddenly I was essential again. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, interrupting my accounting of sacrifices. A text from Sarah. "Hey Mom, thinking about our conversation today. Maybe we could meet with Michael this weekend to discuss options? He has some great ideas about maximizing your assets." Maximizing my assets. Not ensuring my comfort or respecting my wishes. Maximizing assets. Like I was a portfolio to be optimized rather than a person with preferences and dreams. I set the phone down without responding and continued through my mental inventory of emotional labor that had never appeared on any balance sheet. The weekly phone calls where I listened to their problems without reciprocal interest in my life. The way Sarah vented about her marriage troubles while dismissing my loneliness with, "At least you don't have to deal with a difficult husband." The way Michael detailed his business stresses while showing no curiosity about how I spent my days or whether I needed companionship. Thomas, calling sporadically from Seattle, always rushed, always distracted, treating our conversations like obligatory check-ins with an elderly relative rather than meaningful connections with his mother. "How's the weather there, Mom? Good? Great. Listen, I'm swamped at work, but I wanted to call and say hi." Hi. After 6 months of silence, I got hi delivered with the enthusiasm of someone checking items off a to-do list. I thought about my friend Margaret, whose children visited every Sunday for dinner, who went on annual family vacations where everyone genuinely wanted to be there. She'd always been puzzled by my children's absence from my daily life. "Don't you get lonely, Eleanor?" she'd ask gently, and I'd make excuses about their busy careers and demanding schedules. But sitting in my kitchen at 4 a.m, surrounded by evidence of one-sided generosity, I finally admitted the truth. I didn't just get lonely. I lived lonely, sustained only by the hope that my sacrifices were building relationships that would eventually mature into genuine mutual affection. Instead, I'd trained my children to see me as a resource rather than a relationship. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Every time I'd said yes without hesitation, every time I'd prioritized their needs over my own boundaries, every time I'd given money without expecting accountability, I'd been teaching them that my value lay in my utility rather than my humanity. I'd created this dynamic through years of well-intentioned enabling, transforming maternal love into transactional expectation. They didn't call because they missed me. They called because they needed something. They didn't visit because they enjoyed my company. They visited because social conventions required periodic family contact. The evidence was overwhelming once I stopped making excuses for behavior I'd have found unacceptable from anyone else. If a friend had borrowed money repeatedly without repaying it, I'd have distanced myself. If an acquaintance had asked for consistent favors without offering reciprocal support, I'd have recognized the exploitation. But because they were my children, I'd reframed selfish behavior as temporary circumstances, emotional manipulation as normal family dynamics, and financial opportunism as unfortunate but understandable need. The clock chimed 5 times, and I realized I'd been sitting in the dark for over an hour, my coffee growing cold as I processed 30 years of accumulated resentment I'd never allowed myself to acknowledge. I thought about Richard's final months, when the children had visited more frequently, but somehow always found reasons to step outside during the difficult moments. The medication management, the physical assistance, the emotional support that dying people require from those who love them. They'd arrive for the good days and disappear when caregiving became demanding, leaving me to navigate the hardest experience of my life essentially alone. Even at his funeral, they'd managed to make their grief more visible than mine, as if their tears were more valid than those of the woman who'd lost her partner of 46 years. They'd planned the service around their schedules and preferences, selecting readings and music without consulting me about what Richard would have wanted. I'd stood beside his grave, holding his favorite sweater against my chest, while they networked with relatives they hadn't spoken to in years, and made arrangements for dividing his belongings with the efficiency of estate sale organizers. The sun was beginning to rise, casting pink light through my kitchen window, illuminating the neat stacks of financial records that told the story of a woman who'd confused generosity with love and enabling with nurturing. For the first time in decades, I asked myself a question that felt both terrifying and liberating. What if I stopped giving them what they wanted and started asking for what I needed? The answer scared me more than Sarah's cold calculation about my remaining years. Because deep down, I already knew what would happen if I stopped being useful. They'd stop pretending to care at all. 3 days after my sleepless accounting session, Michael called. Not to check on me, not to ask how I was processing our family's financial discussion, but because he needed something. Again, "Mom, I hate to ask, but we have a situation." His voice carried that particular tone of manufactured urgency that I'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that preceded expensive requests wrapped in family emergency packaging. I was sitting in my garden, deadheading the roses Richard had planted for our 20th anniversary. My hands were covered in soil, and I felt more peaceful than I had in days, connected to something growing and alive rather than the suffocating weight of family obligation. "What kind of situation?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer would involve my checkbook. "Tyler's been accepted to that elite soccer camp we talked about. You remember, the one where college scouts come to watch? It's a huge opportunity, but the final payment is due tomorrow, and with Lisa's medical bills from last month." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. The soccer camp. I did remember him mentioning it, but only in passing, the way people mention winning the lottery. Something nice to dream about, but not practical to expect. Apparently, it had moved from dream to expectation without my consultation. "How much, Michael?" $4,000. "I know it's a lot, but this could change Tyler's entire future. Full scholarships, Mom. Division I universities. Can you imagine?" I could imagine. I could imagine my 10-year-old grandson's future being mortgaged against my present security, just like everything else in our family. I could imagine Michael's relief when I said yes, followed by months of silence until the next emergency arose. "I need to think about it," I said, surprising myself with the words. Silence stretched across the phone line like a chasm opening between us. "Think about it?" Michael's voice shifted, confusion replacing confidence. "Mom, the deadline is tomorrow. Tyler's already told his friends he's going. Lisa's been shopping for gear. Already told his friends. Already shopping. They'd spent money they didn't have based on the assumption that Grandma Eleanor would write another check. The presumption was breathtaking in its casualness. "Then maybe you should have asked me before making promises you couldn't keep," I heard myself saying, my voice steadier than I felt. "Mom." Michael's tone turned wounded, the way it had when he was 12 and didn't get the bicycle he'd expected for Christmas. "This isn't like you. Tyler's your grandson. Don't you want him to succeed?" There it was, the guilt wrapped in manipulation, the suggestion that my hesitation made me a bad grandmother rather than a prudent adult protecting her own financial future. "Don't you want him to succeed?" As if success could only be purchased with my money, as if love could only be demonstrated through financial sacrifice. Of course I want Tyler to succeed, but I also want you to learn that success shouldn't depend on your mother's bank account. The words hung in the air between us, and I realized I'd never spoken to my children this directly about money. Ever. For 35 years, I'd been an ATM with a maternal smile, dispensing funds without question or accountability. "Fine," Michael said, his voice cold in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of Sarah's tone at the cafe. "I'll figure something else out. I just thought, after everything Dad left you, you'd want to invest in your grandson's future. After everything Dad left you." As if Richard's life insurance money was family property I was selfishly hoarding rather than my personal financial security. As if my husband's death had been a windfall that obligated me to fund everyone else's dreams. He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat in the garden for another hour, my hands shaking slightly as I processed what had just happened. I'd said no to my son for the first time in his adult life, and instead of understanding or even disappointment, I'd been met with emotional manipulation and barely concealed anger. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Michael told me about Tyler's camp." "Really, Mom? It's just $4,000. You spend more than that on property taxes." Just $4,000. To someone living on a fixed income, carefully budgeting every expense, $4,000 represented months of groceries, a year of utility bills, the difference between financial security and anxiety. But to my children, it was pocket change that their wealthy mother was inexplicably withholding. I didn't respond to the text. 2 hours later, another message. "Emma's birthday is next month. She's hoping for that art program we discussed. $1,200. Let me know if that's going to be a situation, too." The quotation marks around situation felt like a slap. Sarah was mocking my financial caution, turning my reasonable boundaries into evidence of sudden selfishness. Emma's art program, another expense I'd apparently committed to in their minds without my explicit agreement. The messages continued throughout the week. Not one call asking how I was feeling or whether I needed anything. Just a steady stream of financial requests and barely veiled accusations about my changing attitude. Thomas, calling from Seattle. "Sarah mentioned you're being weird about money lately. Everything okay? Should we be worried about your mental state?" My mental state. Because a 73-year-old woman exercising financial discretion obviously indicated cognitive decline rather than delayed wisdom. "My mental state is fine, Thomas. I'm just reevaluating my priorities." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm tired of being treated like a bank account with legs." The words escaped before I could stop them, raw and honest in a way that surprised us both. "Jesus, Mom, that's harsh. We're your kids. We're not trying to use you." But even as he said it, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Because deep down, he knew. They all knew. They'd just gotten so comfortable with the arrangement that they'd forgotten to pretend it was anything else. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when I returned from grocery shopping to find Sarah's car in my driveway. She was sitting on my front porch with a manila folder in her lap, dressed in her most professional outfit, the navy suit she wore to close important real estate deals. "Mom, we need to talk." She stood as I approached, her posture rigid with barely contained frustration. This has gone far enough. I unlocked the front door without responding, carrying my groceries inside while she followed like a process server delivering unwelcome documents. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to my own kitchen table as if she owned it. "I've done some research." She opened the folder and spread papers across the surface, printouts from financial websites, assisted living brochures, legal documents that looked official and intimidating. "I've been looking into conservatorship options," she announced with the calm authority of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "Given your recent erratic behavior regarding financial decisions, Michael and I think it might be time to consider legal protection for your assets." Conservatorship. The word hit me like a physical blow. Legal protection for my assets, which really meant legal control over my assets, transferred from me to them through court proceedings that would declare me incompetent to manage my own life. "You want to have me declared mentally unfit because I refuse to pay for a soccer camp?" "It's not just the soccer camp, Mom. It's the pattern, the suspicion, the sudden hostility toward your own family. These can be signs of cognitive decline, and we'd be irresponsible not to address them." Cognitive decline. Hostility toward family. She was constructing a narrative where my newfound boundaries became symptoms of mental illness, where my refusal to fund their lifestyle became evidence of my unfitness for independent living. I spoke with Dr. Henderson at Sunset Manor, she continued, sliding a brochure toward me. He's willing to conduct an evaluation. Very discreet, very professional. If there's nothing wrong, you'll have nothing to worry about. If there's nothing wrong. As if the burden of proof was on me to demonstrate my sanity, rather than on them to justify their financial demands. I stared at the brochure, seeing sanitized images of elderly people playing board games and participating in supervised activities, their autonomy sacrificed for institutional care. Is this what awaited me? A medical evaluation designed to find fault with my judgment, followed by legal proceedings that would transform me from an independent woman into a ward of the state, or worse, a ward of my children. And if Dr. Henderson finds me competent? Sarah's smile didn't reach her eyes. Then we'll know for sure that your recent behavior is just a phase, and hopefully you'll go back to being the mother we know and love, the mother they knew and loved, the mother who paid for everything without question, who provided childcare without compensation, who prioritized their needs over her own comfort. That mother, the one who'd been slowly disappearing over the past week, was apparently the only version of me they found acceptable. Get out. The words came from somewhere deep inside me, quiet but absolute. Excuse me? I said, get out of my house. Now. Sarah's composure cracked slightly. Mom, you're being irrational. Let's discuss this calmly. There's nothing to discuss. You want me evaluated for incompetence because I won't finance your children's extracurricular activities. You're threatening legal action because I've started saying no to financial requests. That's not mental illness, Sarah. That's called boundaries. I stood up, my whole body trembling with an anger I'd never allowed myself to feel before. I spent 47 years in this house putting my children's needs first. I fed you, clothed you, educated you, and loved you unconditionally. And now that you're adults with your own resources, you want to legally control mine? We're trying to protect you. You're trying to protect your inheritance. There's a difference. The truth hung between us like a gauntlet thrown down. Sarah's face flushed red, her professional mask slipping to reveal the calculation underneath. Fine, she said, gathering her papers with sharp, angry movements. But this conversation isn't over. If you're determined to destroy your relationships with your children over money, that's your choice. But don't come crying to us when you're sitting alone in this house, wondering why no one visits anymore. As if their visits had ever been about anything other than what they could extract from me. She left without another word, her heels clicking across my hardwood floors like bullets being fired. I locked the door behind her and slumped against it, my heart pounding with the adrenaline of confrontation I'd avoided my entire adult life. But for the first time in years, I felt something unexpected. Relief. The pretense was finally over. The mask had slipped. They'd shown me exactly who they were and what they wanted, and I'd finally stopped making excuses for behavior that would have appalled me from anyone else. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Sarah told me about your conversation. This is really disappointing, Mom. We're just trying to help. Just trying to help. By threatening to have me declared incompetent. By demanding control over my finances. By punishing my refusal to bankroll their lifestyle. I turned off my phone and sat in the gathering darkness of my own home, finally understanding that the loneliness I'd been dreading, the isolation they'd threatened me with, was actually freedom. For the first time in decades, no one wanted anything from me, and it felt like coming alive. The silence that followed Sarah's dramatic exit lasted exactly 18 hours. Then my house became a battlefield, and I found myself under siege from 3 different directions. Michael arrived first, unannounced, using the spare key I'd given him for emergencies. I found him in my kitchen at 7 in the morning, making coffee like he owned the place, his face wearing the expression of disappointed authority I remembered from his teenage years. We need to fix this, Mom, he said without preamble, not even bothering with good morning pleasantries. Sarah's upset. Tyler's heartbroken about the soccer camp, and frankly, I'm starting to worry about you. Starting to worry about me. Not worried about my feelings, my perspective, or my well-being. worried about the version of me that was no longer cooperating with their financial expectations. There's nothing to fix, Michael. I'm simply not writing checks on demand anymore. He poured himself coffee from my pot, using my favorite mug, the one Richard had given me that said, "World's Best Mom." The irony wasn't lost on me that my son was drinking from a cup celebrating motherhood while attempting to manipulate the mother it honored. Look, I get it. Sarah came on too strong with the conservatorship thing. That was premature. He sat across from me at my own kitchen table, adopting the reasonable tone he used in business negotiations. But you have to understand how this looks from our perspective, how this looks from their perspective. Not how it feels from mine, but how my newfound boundaries inconvenienced their financial planning. Enlighten me, I said, my voice deliberately neutral. Dad worked his entire life to build security for this family. That money isn't just yours. It's our family's legacy. When you start hoarding it and refusing reasonable requests, it feels like you're betraying what he would have wanted. Hoarding, betraying what Richard would have wanted. Michael was rewriting our entire financial history, transforming my prudent management into selfishness, and my deceased husband into a prop for their arguments. Your father worked his entire life to ensure I would be financially secure after his death, not to create a trust fund for his adult children. But what are you securing it for? You live like a hermit. You drive a car older than some of our employees. You buy generic groceries and wear clothes from discount stores. What's the point of having money if you never use it? There it was again. The assumption that my value lay in spending rather than saving, that my worth was measured by my willingness to fund their comfort rather than protect my own future. They couldn't fathom that perhaps I found security in having resources available rather than depleting them for other people's immediate gratification. Maybe I'm saving it for long-term care when I'm older. Maybe I'm protecting myself from exactly the kind of vulnerability you and Sarah are trying to create. Michael's expression darkened. No one's trying to make you vulnerable, Mom. We're trying to make rational decisions about family resources before it's too late. Before it's too late. Everything came back to my mortality. As if my death was an inconvenient delay in their inheritance timeline rather than the loss of someone they claimed to love. Our conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Through the window, I could see Thomas standing on my front porch, looking uncomfortable but determined. My youngest son, who hadn't visited in person for over 2 years, had apparently flown in from Seattle for this family intervention. You called Thomas? I asked Michael, feeling the net of their coordination tightening around me. We're all concerned, Mom. This affects everyone. I opened the door to find Thomas holding flowers. Grocery store carnations that looked like an afterthought. The kind of gesture men make when they need to appear thoughtful but haven't put actual thought into the effort. Hi, Mom. He kissed my cheek with the mechanical affection of someone fulfilling social obligations. You look tired. The preliminary diagnosis, laying groundwork for their narrative of declining capacity. Not upset, not hurt, not justified in my anger, just tired, as if my emotional responses were symptoms rather than rational reactions to their behavior. The 3 of us sat in my living room, the same room where I'd read them bedtime stories, helped with homework, and celebrated their achievements with pride that seemed misguided in retrospect. Now they formed a united front across from me, and I realized this was no spontaneous gathering. They'd planned this intervention, coordinated their schedules, probably rehearsed their talking points. Mom, Thomas began, his voice carrying the practiced empathy of someone who'd learned to manage difficult conversations in his marketing career. We want to understand what's changed. A month ago, you were happy to help with Tyler's school expenses. Now you're questioning every request like we're strangers asking for handouts. Happy to help. I'd never been asked if I was happy to help. I'd simply been expected to help, and my compliance had been interpreted as happiness rather than resignation. What's changed is that I've started paying attention to patterns instead of individual emergencies, I said. And the pattern is that you contact me when you need money and disappear when you don't. That's not fair. Sarah's voice came from the doorway. I hadn't heard her arrive, but there she stood in my living room entrance, completing their family tribunal. We call all the time. You call when you need something. There's a difference. When was the last time any of you called just to ask how I was doing? I continued, looking at each of their faces in turn. When was the last time you visited without needing money, childcare, or emotional labor? When was the last time you treated me like a person instead of a resource? The silence stretched uncomfortable and long. They exchanged glances with each other, communicating in the wordless language of siblings who'd clearly discussed their strategy before arriving. Finally, Sarah spoke. We're here now, aren't we? We're trying to have a relationship with you, and you're making it impossible. You're here now because I stopped writing checks. If I'd agreed to pay for Tyler's soccer camp, would any of you be sitting in my living room expressing concern about our relationship? Another uncomfortable silence. Look, Michael said, shifting into negotiation mode. Maybe we've taken you for granted. Maybe we should have been more appreciative. But this scorched earth approach isn't healthy for anyone. Tyler's devastated. Emma keeps asking why Grandma doesn't love her anymore. Is this really how you want your grandchildren to remember you? Tyler's devastated. Emma thinks I don't love her anymore. They were weaponizing my grandchildren's emotions, using children as ammunition in an adult conflict about financial boundaries. The manipulation was so calculated it took my breath away. How I want my grandchildren to remember me, I repeated slowly, is as someone who had enough self-respect to stop enabling their parents' financial irresponsibility. Financial irresponsibility? Sarah's voice rose an octave. We're talking about children's activities and educational opportunities. How is that irresponsible? It's irresponsible when you can't afford it and expect someone else to pay for it. It's irresponsible when you make commitments based on other people's money without asking first. It's irresponsible when you treat your mother's savings as your emergency fund. Thomas leaned forward, trying a different approach. Mom, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We don't see you as an ATM. We see you as family. And families help each other. Families help each other mutually, Thomas. This has been entirely one-directional for years. That's not true. We help you too. How? How exactly do you help me? Another silence. They looked at each other, searching for examples that apparently didn't exist. We visit, Michael said finally. When you need something, we call. When you need something, we include you in family events, where I'm expected to bring gifts and pay for meals. Each response was weaker than the last, revealing the poverty of their actual contribution to my life versus their expectations of my contribution to theirs. Sarah tried a different tactic. What about when Dad was sick? We were here for you then. The audacity of using Richard's death as evidence of their support made my blood pressure spike. You were here for the good days and vanished during the hard ones. I changed his diapers alone. I managed his medications alone. I held him during the terrifying nights alone. You showed up for visiting hours and disappeared when actual caregiving was required. We had our own lives, our own responsibilities. And I didn't? I was grieving too, but somehow my grief came second to your convenience. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock Richard had bought for our 25th anniversary. Each tick marked another moment of truth they couldn't refute. Finally, Michael played what he clearly thought was his strongest card. Fine. You want to know the truth? The truth is that Tyler already told his team he was going to soccer camp. Lisa already bought his equipment. We already rearranged our vacation schedule to accommodate it. Your refusal doesn't just affect us. It affects a 10-year-old boy who doesn't understand why his grandmother suddenly stopped caring about his dreams. The manipulation was breathtaking in its sophistication. They'd created a scenario where my financial boundaries would directly hurt my grandson, where saying no to them meant disappointing a child. They'd manufactured a crisis that painted me as the villain in my grandchild's story. But for the first time in my adult life, I saw through the manipulation clearly. You created that situation, Michael. You made promises using my money without my permission. You raised Tyler's expectations based on assumptions about my financial participation. And now you're blaming me for the disappointment you created. So you're really going to let Tyler suffer because you want to make a point? Let Tyler suffer. As if the consequences of their poor planning were my responsibility to fix, rather than theirs to manage. I'm going to let Tyler learn that promises should only be made with money you actually have. And I'm going to let you learn that your mother isn't a backup plan for your financial shortfalls. Sarah stood up abruptly, her professional composure finally cracking completely. This is insane. You're destroying our family over money. Money that Dad intended for all of us. Dad intended that money to keep me safe and secure, not to subsidize your lifestyle choices. Safe and secure for what? You're 73 years old. How much security do you need? The cruelty of the question hung in the air like poison gas. How much security did a 73-year-old woman need? Enough to maintain independence rather than dependence. Enough to pay for her own care rather than becoming a burden. Enough to maintain dignity rather than desperation. Enough security to never have to depend on children who see me as a financial inconvenience they're destined to inherit from. The words hit their target with precision. All three of them recoiled slightly, recognizing the accuracy of an accusation they couldn't deny. Thomas tried one last appeal. Mom, please, can't we find some middle ground here? Maybe we could set up a family meeting with a financial planner, discuss everyone's needs. Everyone's needs? I laughed, surprising myself with the bitterness in the sound. Thomas, when was the last time anyone in this room asked about my needs? When was the last time any of you considered that I might have dreams, goals, desires that don't revolve around funding yours? Silence. Get out, I said quietly. All of you, get out of my house. Mom, Michael started. Get out. The volume of my own voice shocked me. I'd never raised my voice to my children in their entire lives, but something fundamental had shifted inside me, something that refused to be manipulated, cajoled, or guilt-tripped back into financial submission. They left reluctantly, exchanging worried glances and murmured conversations I wasn't meant to overhear. Sarah paused at the door. This isn't over, Mom. We're not going to let you destroy yourself out of spite. The only thing I'm destroying is the illusion that my value to this family extends beyond my bank account. After they left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the echoing silence of a house that had just hosted its last family intervention. My hands were shaking, but not from fear or uncertainty. They were shaking from the exhilaration of finally speaking truth to people who'd grown comfortable with lies. For the first time in decades, I was completely alone, and I'd never felt more free. The morning after my family's coordinated assault, I woke up at 9:30, 2 hours later than my usual routine. For the first time in months, I'd slept through the night without waking to worry about someone else's crisis, someone else's needs, someone else's emergency that would somehow become my financial responsibility. I lay in bed for 10 more minutes, listening to the birds outside my window and marveling at the strange lightness in my chest. It took me several minutes to identify the sensation. Relief. Pure, uncomplicated relief. My phone sat silent on the nightstand. No emergency texts demanding immediate attention. No voicemails from children who'd suddenly remembered they loved me only after needing something. No urgent requests wrapped in emotional manipulation and delivered with deadline pressure. Just silence. I made coffee in my favorite mug, the one Michael had been using yesterday like he owned it, and sat at my kitchen table with a notepad. For the first time in years, I was going to plan a day around my own desires rather than other people's emergencies. The list I wrote surprised me with its simplicity. Visit the library, browse for pleasure, not research someone else's problems. Buy flowers for myself, not for a grandchild's school event or a family obligation. Take a long bath with expensive bath salts, the ones I'd been saving for special occasions that never came. Call Margaret and accept her standing invitation for lunch. Look into that painting class at the community center. 5 simple activities that felt revolutionary after decades of structuring my time around everyone else's schedule. When had I stopped having hobbies? When had I forgotten that I used to love watercolor painting? When had self-care become selfish instead of necessary? The community library was a 15-minute drive through neighborhoods I rarely explored anymore, having confined my outings to errands and obligations for so long that I'd forgotten the pleasure of aimless wandering. I parked in the shade of a maple tree and walked into the building that smelled of old books and fresh coffee from the small cafe near the entrance. For the first time in years, I browsed fiction instead of practical guides. No books about managing finances, caring for aging parents, or resolving family conflicts. Just stories, mysteries, romance novels, historical fiction, books chosen purely because they sparked curiosity rather than served a purpose. I selected 3 novels and a book about watercolor techniques, feeling like a teenager checking out forbidden material. When had reading for pleasure become such a foreign concept? When had I started feeling guilty about spending time on activities that didn't benefit someone else? The librarian was a woman about my age, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "These are wonderful choices," she said, stamping my books with the rhythmic precision of someone who'd performed this ritual thousands of times. "Are you new to watercolors?" "Returning to them, actually. I used to paint when I was younger, before." I trailed off, realizing I'd been about to say, "before my family needed me more." How many interests had I abandoned in service of other people's priorities? "It's never too late to rediscover old passions," she said with a smile that felt genuine rather than obligatory. "We have a painting group that meets Thursday mornings if you're interested. Very informal, very welcoming." A painting group. Other people who prioritized creativity over crisis management, who spent Thursday mornings exploring beauty rather than solving problems they hadn't created. "I'd like that," I heard myself saying. "I'd like that very much." The flower shop was my next stop, a small business I'd driven past hundreds of times without ever entering for myself. I'd bought flowers here for others, arrangements for my children's achievements, sympathy bouquets for their losses, apology flowers when family tensions needed smoothing, but never just flowers for Eleanor, because Eleanor wanted to see something beautiful in her own home. The owner, a woman in her 40s with soil under her fingernails and paint-stained apron, greeted me like an old friend. "What's the occasion?" she asked, gesturing toward the rainbow of blooms surrounding us. "No occasion," I said, feeling rebellious just saying it. "I want flowers because I want flowers." Her smile lit up her entire face. "Those are the best kind. What speaks to you?" I wandered through the small shop, touching petals and inhaling fragrances I'd never taken time to appreciate. Sunflowers reminded me of the painting I'd started but never finished 30 years ago. White lilies evoked the wedding bouquet I'd carried when Richard and I promised to build a life together. Pink roses called back to the garden we'd planted in our first house, before children and responsibilities crowded out time for beauty. I chose them all. "You're creating a celebration," the florist observed as she arranged my selections with artistic precision. "These flowers are pure joy." Pure joy. When had I last felt pure joy? Not relief that a crisis was resolved, not satisfaction that someone else's needs were met, not the exhausted pride of problems solved, just joy for its own sake. The flowers filled my car with fragrance that made the drive home feel like a journey to somewhere new, rather than a return to familiar obligations. I arranged them in vases throughout my house, transforming spaces that had felt functional into environments that celebrated beauty for its own sake. Margaret answered her phone on the second ring, her voice brightening when she recognized mine. "Eleanor, how wonderful to hear from you. I was just thinking about you yesterday." Thinking about me. Not needing something from me. Not requiring my assistance with a problem. Just thinking about me as a friend whose company she valued. "I was wondering if your lunch invitation is still open," I said, feeling nervous in a way that reminded me of asking someone to dance in high school. "Of course. Today, tomorrow, I'm free whenever you are. Free whenever you are." The casual assumption that my time belonged to me, that I could make plans based on my own availability rather than coordinating around everyone else's schedule. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place I'd always been too busy to explore. Margaret was already seated at a corner table, her face lighting up when she saw me approach. "You look different," she said as I sat down. "Lighter somehow. Lighter." It was exactly how I felt, as if I'd been carrying invisible weight for so long that its absence felt like floating. Over soup and sandwiches, I found myself telling Margaret about the past 2 weeks. The family confrontations, the financial demands, the conservatorship threats. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. "Eleanor," she said finally, reaching across the table to touch my hand, "what you're describing isn't family concern. It's financial abuse. Financial abuse. I'd never heard the term applied to family relationships, had never considered that love could be weaponized in service of exploitation. They love me, I said automatically, the response so practiced it felt like reciting a prayer. People who love you don't threaten to have you declared incompetent when you set financial boundaries. People who love you don't coordinate interventions to pressure you into funding their lifestyle choices. She was right. And hearing the truth spoken aloud by someone outside the situation made it impossible to deny. My children's behavior toward me would be recognizable as abuse if performed by strangers, but family relationships provided camouflage that made exploitation look like concern. "What do I do?" I asked, surprised by how vulnerable the question made me feel. "You keep doing exactly what you're doing. You prioritize your own well-being. You stop setting yourself on fire to keep other people warm." That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took a bath in the middle of the day without justifying it as necessary for any reason beyond my own pleasure. I used the expensive bath salts Sarah had given me 3 Christmases ago, the ones I'd been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to arrive. The hot water felt like absolution, washing away years of accumulated guilt about taking time for myself. I read one of my library books while soaking, letting the mystery unfold at its own pace without checking my phone or worrying about who might need me. For 2 hours, I existed solely for myself. That evening, I called the community center about the painting class. The instructor, a retired art teacher named Helen, was enthusiastic about welcoming a new student. "We meet Tuesday and Thursday mornings," she explained. "Very relaxed atmosphere. Some of our painters are beginners. Others have been with us for years. Everyone supports everyone else. Everyone supports everyone else." What a revolutionary concept. A group where mutual aid flowed in all directions, rather than being extracted by some members from others. "I'll be there Tuesday," I said, adding the appointment to my calendar like it was the most important meeting of my week, because maybe it was. That night, as I arranged my flowers one final time before bed, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Mom, I think we all said things we didn't mean yesterday. Can we try again? Tyler's really upset. Still using my grandchild's emotions as leverage, still treating my boundaries as problems to be solved rather than decisions to be respected." I turned off my phone without responding. Standing in my kitchen surrounded by flowers I'd bought for myself, books I'd chosen for pleasure, and the lingering scent of bath salts I'd used for pure indulgence, I realized something profound. I wasn't just setting boundaries with my children. I was remembering who I used to be before I became the person everyone else needed me to be. And she was someone worth protecting. The silence in my house that night wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility, rich with the promise of days structured around my own desires rather than other people's demands. I fell asleep planning my first painting in 30 years, dreaming of watercolor flowers that bloomed for no one but me. For the first time in decades, I went to sleep excited about tomorrow instead of anxious about who might need me to solve their problems. The feeling was intoxicating. The feeling was freedom. My newfound peace lasted exactly 6 days. On the following Monday morning, while I was preparing for my second painting class, the doorbell rang with the insistent, prolonged pressing that signals emergency or desperation. Through the peephole, I saw all 3 of my children standing on my porch. But they weren't alone. Emma and Tyler flanked their parents like tiny soldiers in an emotional war I hadn't declared. My 10-year-old grandson wore his soccer uniform, the one Lisa had apparently bought for the camp I'd refused to fund. My 12-year-old granddaughter clutched a handmade card with, "We love you, Grandma," written in the careful script of a child who'd been coached on what to say. The manipulation was so calculated, so deliberate, that it took my breath away. They'd brought reinforcements. I opened the door slowly, my hand trembling slightly as I took in the scene they'd orchestrated. Tyler's eyes were red-rimmed. Whether from genuine tears or allergies, I couldn't tell. Emma looked confused, glancing between her mother and me like she was trying to understand why the adults in her life were using her as a messenger. "Hi, Grandma," Tyler said, his voice small and rehearsed. "I wanted to ask you something." The words were his, but the timing, the staging, the presence of all three parents behind him. None of that was his idea. I was watching my grandchildren being weaponized in real time. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, ignoring the adults completely and focusing on his young face. "What did you want to ask me? Why don't you love me anymore?" The question hit like a physical blow, perfectly designed to bypass every rational boundary I'd established. A 10-year-old boy asking his grandmother why she'd stopped loving him. What kind of monster would I have to be to maintain my position in the face of such innocent pain? But I looked past Tyler's earnest confusion to Sarah's expectant expression, and I saw the coaching, the preparation, the careful orchestration of childhood emotions to serve adult financial goals. "Tyler," I said gently, kneeling to his eye level, "I love you more than you'll ever know. My love for you has nothing to do with soccer camps or money. But Mom said you won't help me go to camp because you don't care about my dreams." There it was. The poison they'd dripped into his 10-year-old understanding of our relationship. They'd told him my financial boundaries were evidence of emotional rejection, that my refusal to fund his activities meant I'd stopped caring about his future. I looked up at Michael, my voice quiet but clear. "You told your son that my love is conditional on my financial contributions?" "We told him the truth," Michael replied, his jaw set with righteous anger. "That his grandmother has money to help him succeed, but chooses not to." "The truth," I repeated, standing slowly. "The truth is that you made promises you couldn't keep and taught your son to blame his grandmother for your poor planning." Emma stepped forward, offering me her card with the shy smile that had always melted my heart. "I made this for you, Grandma, to show you we still love you even though you're mad at us. Even though you're mad at us." They'd framed this entire conflict as my emotional instability rather than their financial exploitation. In their narrative, I was the unreasonable grandmother having a tantrum, and they were the patient family trying to restore harmony. I took Emma's card, genuinely touched by her effort despite despising the manipulation that had prompted it. "Thank you, sweetheart. This is beautiful. Are you going to help Tyler with soccer camp?" she asked with the directness only children possess. "He practices every day in our backyard." The trap was perfect. Answer yes, and I'd validate their strategy of using children as emotional blackmail. Answer no, and I'd crush a 12-year-old's hope for her cousin's happiness. Either response made me the villain in a story they'd carefully constructed. "Emma," I said carefully, "Tyler's soccer camp isn't something I need to decide. That's something his parents need to figure out with their own money." "But they don't have enough money," she said with brutal honesty. "Mom said you have lots of money, but you won't share." Won't share. They'd reduced complex financial boundaries to playground concepts of fairness, teaching my grandchildren that my refusal to fund their lifestyle was selfish rather than reasonable. Thomas stepped forward, perhaps sensing that the children weren't achieving the desired effect. "Mom, look at what this is doing to the family. Emma doesn't understand why you're suddenly different. Tyler thinks he did something wrong. Is this really worth it? Is this really worth it?" As if protecting my financial security and demanding basic respect was a luxury I should sacrifice for family harmony. As if returning to the role of compliant ATM was the reasonable solution to conflict I hadn't created. What's worth it, Thomas, is teaching my grandchildren that love isn't something you purchase with money. What's worth it is showing them that adults should keep promises they can afford, rather than expecting other people to make good on their commitments. "So you're choosing money over family?" Sarah's voice carried the perfect pitch of wounded martyrdom. "I'm choosing self-respect over manipulation, Grandma," Tyler said, his voice breaking slightly. "I promise I'll pay you back when I'm older. I'll get a job and save money and give it all to you." The sweetness of his offer, the earnestness of a 10-year-old promising to repay $4,000 from future minimum wage earnings, nearly undid my resolve. This was exactly what they'd counted on. That my love for my grandchildren would override my judgment about their parents' behavior. But I realized something in that moment. Protecting my grandchildren from their parents' manipulation was more important than protecting their parents' feelings. "Tyler," I said, kneeling again to meet his eyes, "you don't owe me anything. You don't need to pay me back for anything. And you especially don't need to feel guilty about something that isn't your responsibility." I looked directly at Michael as I continued. "Sometimes adults make promises they can't keep, and that's not your fault. It's not your job to fix adult problems with guilt or promises or feeling bad. Mom, Michael started, but I cut him off. No. You brought children into a financial dispute between adults. You coached them to ask questions designed to manipulate me. You taught them that my love is conditional on my wallet. That stops now. I stood and looked at each of my children in turn. Here's what's going to happen. Tyler and Emma are going inside to have cookies and milk, while the adults have a conversation they should have had without involving children in the first place. We're not leaving the kids, Sarah began. Yes, you are, because this ends today. All of it. I ushered my grandchildren into the kitchen, gave them cookies from the jar I kept stocked for their visits, and settled them at the table with coloring books I'd bought but never had chance to share because their parents' visits were always crisis-focused rather than relationship-focused. Are you really mad at Mommy and Daddy? Emma asked as she selected a purple crayon. I'm disappointed that they taught you to worry about adult problems, I said honestly. But I'm not mad at you. I could never be mad at you. When I returned to the living room, my 3 children were huddled in what looked like a strategy session. They separated as I approached, forming a line of defense against whatever confrontation they expected. Sit down, I said, gesturing to the sofa. All of you. They complied reluctantly, probably expecting another lecture about boundaries and financial responsibility. Instead, I walked to my bedroom and returned with a manila folder. One I'd spent the weekend preparing. These are copies of bank records showing every financial transfer I've made to each of your families over the past 10 years, I said, placing the folder on the coffee table between us. The total is $217,000 in direct payments, loans, and gifts. The silence was immediate and profound. This doesn't include childcare, which at minimum wage would have added another $30,000. It doesn't include gifts, groceries I've bought for your families, or expenses I've covered during visits. Sarah reached for the folder, her real estate training kicking in as she began scanning the documents. Her face grew paler with each page. None of these loans have been repaid, I continued. None of these gifts have been acknowledged with genuine gratitude. And now you want me to give you legal control over the remainder of my assets through conservatorship proceedings. Mom, Thomas said weakly, we never thought about it like that. No, you didn't think about it at all. You took and took and took, and when I finally said no, you brought my grandchildren here to guilt me into saying yes again. I pulled out a second document, one I'd had my attorney prepare that weekend. This is a formal statement of my financial boundaries going forward. No more loans, no more gifts exceeding $100 per family per year, no more emergency funding, no more bailouts. Michael's business mind was clearly calculating the implications. Mom, what if there's a real emergency? Medical bills, job loss, something serious? Then you'll handle it the way every other adult handles emergencies, with insurance, savings, payment plans, or by adjusting your lifestyle to match your income. You're really going to let us struggle when you could help? Sarah's voice carried disbelief that bordered on shock. I'm going to let you be adults. I'm going to stop enabling your dependence on me and start expecting you to manage your own financial lives. The third document was the one that would change everything permanently. And this, I said, placing it on top of the others, is my new will. The effect was immediate. All 3 of them leaned forward, and I saw something die in their eyes. The last vestige of pretense that this was about relationship rather than inheritance. I'm leaving everything to charity. The entire estate. Every dollar your father and I saved. Every asset we accumulated. Every bit of security we built. It's going to organizations that help elderly people maintain independence and dignity. The silence stretched so long I could hear Tyler and Emma chattering in the kitchen, their innocent voices a stark contrast to the shock radiating from their parents. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice hollow. You're really going to give our inheritance to strangers? Our inheritance. Not my estate, not the money Richard and I had earned, but their inheritance. As if they'd already claimed ownership of assets I was still using to support myself. I'm going to give my money to people who will use it to help others, rather than fund lifestyle choices they can't afford. This is insane, Michael said, standing abruptly. You're destroying our family over what? Because we asked for help? I'm ending a pattern where my children treat me like a bank account with emotional vulnerabilities they can exploit. If that destroys our family, then our family was built on a foundation that deserved to crumble. Thomas was studying the will document, his marketing mind probably analyzing the language for loopholes. This isn't final, right? You could change this? I could, but I won't. Not unless you prove that you value me for something other than my financial utility. How are we supposed to prove that? Sarah asked, tears starting to flow. Whether from genuine emotion or calculated effect, I couldn't tell anymore. By having a relationship with me that doesn't involve asking for money. By visiting when you don't need anything. By calling to ask how I'm doing instead of what I can do for you. By treating me like your mother instead of your benefactor. And if we do that, you'll change the will back? Even now, even faced with complete disinheritance, their focus remained on the money rather than the relationship. If you do that, I said quietly, you'll discover that having a relationship with your mother is its own reward, and the will won't matter anymore. They left without saying goodbye to their children, forcing me to explain to Tyler and Emma that their parents had suddenly remembered other obligations. The children seemed relieved rather than disappointed, perhaps sensing the tension that surrounded every interaction between the adults in their lives. As I watched my children drive away, possibly for the last time, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. The battle was over. The lines were drawn, and for the first time in my adult life, I held all the power in our relationship. They could choose to love me without conditions, or they could choose to lose me entirely, but they could no longer choose to use me. And that choice, I realized, was the greatest gift I'd ever given myself. 3 weeks passed without a single call from any of my children. 3 weeks of silence that should have felt like punishment, but instead felt like permission. Permission to discover who Eleanor Whitman was when she wasn't constantly managing other people's crises. The painting class had become the anchor of my new routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, I joined 7 other women in the community center's art room, where easels stood in a circle like a support group for recovering people-pleasers. Helen, our instructor, had the gentle wisdom of someone who understood that creativity required vulnerability, and she created a space where imperfection was celebrated rather than corrected. My first painting was terrible. Muddy colors and shaky lines that betrayed how long I'd neglected this part of myself. But it was mine. For the first time in decades, I'd created something that existed purely because I wanted it to exist, not because it served someone else's needs or solved someone else's problems. Don't judge it, Helen advised as I stared critically at my amateur attempt at roses. Just feel proud that you showed up for yourself today. Showed up for myself. What a revolutionary concept. The other women in class became unexpected allies in my journey toward selfhood. Dorothy, a retired nurse whose children lived across the country, understood the loneliness of empty nest syndrome without the compensation of regular contact. Marie, a widow whose late husband's gambling had left her financially insecure, recognized the fear of being seen as a burden rather than a person. But it was Janet who became my closest friend in this new chapter of my life. 78 years old, with silver hair she wore in a practical bob and eyes that sparkled with mischief, Janet had divorced her husband of 50 years when she discovered he'd been systematically draining their retirement account to fund his addiction to online gambling. "Best decision I ever made," she told me over coffee after our 3rd class together. 50 years of marriage, and it took me 49 to realize I was married to a man who saw me as a resource rather than a partner. Janet lived alone in a small apartment downtown, had taken up ballroom dancing at 75, and traveled with senior groups to places she'd always wanted to see but had never been able to visit because her husband considered vacations wasteful spending. "Eleanor," she said during one of our post-painting coffee sessions, "you remind me of myself 3 years ago, terrified to admit that the people closest to you have been taking advantage of your love." "How did you get past the guilt?" I asked, stirring sugar into my cappuccino while watching other customers live their uncomplicated lives. I realized that feeling guilty about protecting myself was just another way of putting other people's comfort before my own well-being. The guilt was trained into me by people who benefited from my self-sacrifice. Janet introduced me to her world of senior activities that existed entirely outside the sphere of family obligation. We attended lectures at the local college, explored art galleries I'd driven past for years without entering, and discovered restaurants that didn't require special occasions to justify their expense. "You know what I learned?" Janet said as we toured a photography exhibition featuring local artists. "I learned that I'd been living my life like I was preparing for it to begin, always saving money for someday, always postponing pleasure until it was convenient for other people, always treating my own desires like luxuries I couldn't afford." She stopped in front of a photograph of a woman dancing alone in her kitchen, captured in a moment of pure, unself-conscious joy. "I want to feel like that," she said. "Like my happiness matters for its own sake." I started feeling like that too. My days developed a rhythm that prioritized presence over productivity. Morning coffee with the newspaper, actually reading the articles instead of scanning for information that might affect my children's interests. Afternoon walks through neighborhoods I'd never explored, noticing architecture and gardens and the changing seasons in ways I'd been too busy to appreciate before. I joined the library's book club, where 12 women gathered monthly to discuss literature and share perspectives shaped by decades of diverse experience. For the first time in years, I had opinions about things that didn't relate to family management, thoughts that emerged from personal interest rather than obligation. I started cooking elaborate meals for myself, not because company was coming or because someone else needed feeding, but because I deserved nourishing food prepared with care and attention. I set my dining room table with the good china I'd been saving for special occasions, lit candles, played classical music, and treated myself like a guest worthy of my own hospitality. The changes weren't just emotional, they were physical. The tension I'd carried in my shoulders for years began to ease. I slept better, woke refreshed, and discovered energy I'd forgotten I possessed. My reflection in the mirror showed a woman who looked younger somehow, as if the weight of constant worry had been aging me prematurely. One Thursday afternoon, while browsing in a boutique I'd never had time to explore, I bought myself a dress that wasn't practical or sensible or chosen for its versatility. It was turquoise silk with a flowing skirt that made me feel feminine and elegant, adjectives I hadn't applied to myself in years. The saleswoman, a stylish woman in her 60s, smiled as she wrapped my purchase. "Special occasion?" "Yes," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "Every day I choose to honor myself is a special occasion." 6 weeks after my final confrontation with my children, Margaret invited me to join her and her husband for their annual weekend trip to a bed and breakfast in Door County, Wisconsin. "We always book a room for 3, she explained, "in case we want to invite a friend. This year, we'd love that friend to be you." The idea of traveling for pleasure, of spending money on experiences rather than other people's emergencies, felt both terrifying and exhilarating. When had I last gone somewhere purely because I wanted to see something beautiful? "I'd love to," I told her, and meant it completely. The weekend in Door County was a revelation. We stayed at a Victorian inn overlooking Lake Michigan, where my room had a fireplace and a view of water that stretched to the horizon. I walked beaches at sunrise, browsed antique shops filled with treasures that spoke to aesthetic pleasure rather than practical need, and ate meals chosen for taste rather than economy. On Saturday evening, as we sat on the inn's porch watching the sunset, paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Margaret's husband Robert raised his wine glass in a toast. "To Eleanor," he said, his eyes kind behind wire-rimmed glasses, "for having the courage to choose herself, for having the courage to choose myself." The phrase resonated long after we'd finished our wine and retired to our rooms. I'd spent 73 years believing that choosing myself was selfish, that prioritizing my own needs over other people's wants was a character flaw rather than a basic requirement for mental health. But lying in a comfortable bed in a beautiful room I'd paid for with money I'd earned, listening to waves crash against the shore outside my window, I understood that choosing myself wasn't selfish, it was essential. How could I love others genuinely if I'd never learned to love myself? How could I contribute meaningfully to the world if I'd never taken time to discover what I had to offer? That Sunday morning, as I sat by the lake with my journal and a cup of coffee, I wrote something I'd never written before, a list of dreams. Not practical goals or family-related objectives, but dreams. Things I wanted to experience purely for the joy of experiencing them. I wanted to take a painting workshop in Tuscany. I wanted to learn to speak French. I wanted to volunteer with literacy programs, teaching adults to read. I wanted to mentor young women starting their careers, sharing wisdom I'd gained through decades of experience. I wanted to travel to Ireland, the trip Richard and I had postponed until it was too late. For the first time in my adult life, I was dreaming about my future rather than managing other people's presents. The drive home from Door County felt different than any journey I'd taken in years. I wasn't rushing back to crises or obligations. I was returning to a life I was actively creating rather than simply enduring. My house looked different too when I pulled into the driveway. Not empty or lonely, but peaceful in mine. A sanctuary I'd created for myself rather than a way station for other people's needs. As I unpacked my weekend bag and arranged the beautiful pottery I'd bought at a local artist's studio, my phone rang. For a moment, my old anxiety spiked. Who needed me? What emergency required my immediate attention? But then I remembered. No one needed me to solve their problems anymore. The call could wait while I finished unpacking, while I made myself tea, while I took time to process the joy of a weekend spent entirely on my own pleasure. When I finally checked my voicemail, I found a message from Tyler. "Hi, Grandma. I just wanted to call and tell you about my soccer game today. I scored 2 goals. Mom gave me your number and said I could call you myself if I wanted to talk to you. I miss you. I hope you're having a good day." I listened to the message 3 times, my heart swelling with love for this child who'd called not because he needed something, but because he wanted to share his joy with me. This was what relationship looked like when it wasn't contaminated by financial transactions. Pure connection, offered freely, without agenda or manipulation. I called him back immediately. "Grandma." His voice lit up with genuine excitement. "Did you get my message?" "I did, sweetheart. Tell me everything about your game." For 20 minutes, we talked about soccer and school and the book he was reading. Not once did he mention money or camps or things he needed. We simply enjoyed each other's company across the phone line, grandmother and grandson connecting through shared affection rather than financial dependency. When we hung up, I realized something profound. This conversation was more meaningful than any I'd had with my children in years. Tyler had called me because he loved me, not because he needed me to solve a problem or fund a solution. And that distinction made all the difference in the world. As evening settled over my peaceful house, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine and my sketch pad, drawing flowers that bloomed for no one but me. The silence around me wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility, rich with the promise of a life finally lived on my own terms. For the first time in decades, I was excited about tomorrow, not because of what I could do for someone else, but because of what I might discover about myself. The woman I was becoming felt like someone I'd always been but had forgotten how to be. And she was magnificent. 8 months had passed since I'd thrown my children out of my house, and I was standing in the Florence airport, clutching my boarding pass for the painting workshop in Tuscany I'd dreamed about writing down by the lake. At 74 years old, I was about to board my first international flight alone. My first adventure chosen purely for joy rather than obligation. The woman checking my passport smiled at my obvious excitement. "First time to Italy? First time anywhere for myself," I said, surprising us both with my honesty. The flight was everything I'd imagined. Clouds stretching like cotton fields below, a meal I didn't have to cook or clean up after, hours to read without interruption. I sketched fellow passengers in my journal, capturing moments of quiet happiness that reminded me how much beauty existed when you had time to notice it. Villa Beatrice sat nestled in the Tuscan hills like something from a painting itself, surrounded by olive groves and vineyards that rolled toward the horizon in waves of green and gold. My room overlooked a garden where lavender and rosemary perfumed the evening air, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to feel wealthy. Not because of my bank account, but because of my freedom to experience beauty without guilt. The other women in the workshop were from around the world: a retired teacher from Australia, a former CEO from London, a librarian from Toronto who'd started painting after her divorce. We were all women who'd discovered art later in life, who'd finally given ourselves permission to create without justification. On the third day, While we painted the morning light filtering through cypress trees, I received a call from an unknown number. My first instinct was to ignore it. Nothing good ever came from unexpected calls during peaceful moments. But something made me answer. Grandma Eleanor? The voice was Emma's, but older, more mature than I remembered. Emma, sweetheart? How did you get this number? I found your travel information in Mom's desk. She's been keeping track of you, I think. Are you really in Italy? The question carried wonder rather than accusation, and I realized my granddaughter was 17 now, old enough to understand that her grandmother had a life beyond family service. I am. I'm taking a painting class in Tuscany. That's so cool. I'm taking art classes too at school. I wanted to ask you something. I excused myself from the group and walked to a quiet corner of the garden, sensing this conversation required privacy. What is it, sweetheart? I'm applying to art school for next year. Mom and Dad say it's impractical, that I should study business or something more realistic. But I remember you used to paint when I was little. Before everything got complicated. Such a diplomatic way to describe the financial manipulation that had poisoned our family relationships. I still paint, I told her. In fact, I'm working on a landscape right now that reminds me of the flowers you used to pick in my garden. Really? You kept painting? I rediscovered it. Sometimes we have to lose things to understand how much they meant to us. Emma was quiet for a moment, and I could hear the weight of teenage uncertainty across the ocean. Grandma, can I ask you something else? Something personal? Of course. Were Mom and Dad and Uncle Thomas were they really using you for money? The directness of the question, delivered without the manipulation I'd grown accustomed to from her parents, took my breath away. Here was my granddaughter, almost an adult herself, asking for truth, rather than validation of a narrative someone else had constructed. What do you think, Emma? When you look back at how they treated me, what do you see? I see them always asking you for things. And I see you always saying yes, even when it made you sad. And I see them getting angry when you finally said no. The clarity in her young voice made me proud and heartbroken simultaneously. She'd witnessed everything, processed it with the brutal honesty only children possess, and reached her own conclusions despite her parents' attempts to control the narrative. You're a very wise young woman, Emma. I don't feel wise. I feel confused. I love my parents, but I also remember how happy you looked when you stopped being stressed all the time. You smile more now, in your photos. My photos. I'd been posting pictures from my new life on social media, not to prove anything to my children, but to share joy with friends like Margaret and Janet who celebrated my adventures. I hadn't considered that my grandchildren might be watching, learning that their grandmother had a life worth documenting beyond family obligations. Emma, what your parents did to me, it wasn't evil or malicious. They just forgot that I was a person with my own dreams and needs. Sometimes people who love us can still hurt us when they start seeing us as resources rather than human beings. Is that why you changed your will? Mom talks about it sometimes when she thinks Tyler and I aren't listening. Of course they discussed my will in front of the children. Of course they'd made my financial decisions part of family dinner conversation, teaching another generation that love and money were interconnected rather than separate phenomena. I changed my will to protect my own future and to teach your parents that they couldn't depend on my money to solve their problems. But Emma, if you need help with art school, real help, not manipulation or guilt trips, you can always call me directly. You'd do that? Even after everything? I'd do that because I love you and believe in your talent, not because your parents orchestrated a crisis or coached you on what to say. Emma started crying then, soft tears that carried years of confusion and divided loyalty. I miss you, Grandma. I miss the you that existed before all the fighting about money. I miss you too, sweetheart. But the woman you remember, the one who was always stressed and tired and sad, she wasn't really me. She was who I became when I forgot how to value myself. We talked for another 20 minutes about art and dreams and the courage required to choose a path others consider impractical. When we hung up, I realized something profound. Emma was the first family member to contact me without wanting something, to engage with curiosity rather than manipulation, to see me as a person worth knowing rather than a problem to solve. That evening, as I painted the sunset over the Tuscan countryside, I received a text from Tyler. "Grandma, Emma told me you're in Italy studying art. That's awesome. I made the varsity soccer team without the expensive camp. Turns out talent matters more than money. Hope you're having fun." Tyler had made varsity. On his own merit, through his own effort, without the $4,000 camp his parents had demanded I fund. He'd learned something they apparently hadn't. That achievement earned honestly feels better than success purchased with someone else's sacrifice. I typed back, "Congratulations, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. Send me a picture in your varsity uniform." The photo arrived minutes later. Tyler grinning in his team jersey, holding a trophy, surrounded by teammates who looked genuinely happy to celebrate with him. This was what success looked like when it wasn't contaminated by guilt or obligation. Pure joy, earned through personal effort, celebrated without strings attached. 3 days before my flight home, I received an email from Sarah. Not a text, not a phone call, but a formal email with the subject line "Family Discussion Request." "Eleanor, I hope you're well. I wanted to reach out because Emma mentioned she spoke with you about art school. Michael, Thomas, and I have been discussing our family situation, and we think it might be time to have an honest conversation about moving forward. We realize we may have been overly focused on financial matters in our relationship with you. We'd like to explore whether there's a way to rebuild our connection that doesn't involve money discussions. Would you be willing to meet with us when you return from Italy? We understand if you need time to think about it. Sarah." The email was carefully crafted, probably written and rewritten multiple times, designed to sound contrite without actually admitting fault. Overly focused on financial matters was corporate speak for systematically exploited your generosity, and rebuild our connection suggested they wanted relationship without acknowledging what had damaged it in the first place. But something in the formal tone, the absence of manipulation or deadline pressure, suggested genuine reconsideration rather than calculated strategy. Maybe losing access to my money had forced them to examine their behavior in ways that confrontation never could. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I spent my final days in Tuscany painting and thinking about forgiveness. Not the kind that enabled further exploitation, but the kind that acknowledged human complexity while maintaining protective boundaries. The flight home gave me 12 hours to consider what reconciliation might look like if I chose to pursue it. Not a return to the old patterns, not financial re-engagement, but perhaps the possibility of relationship based on mutual respect rather than one-sided utility. Margaret met me at the airport, her face lighting up when she saw me emerge from customs with paint-stained fingers and a portfolio of Italian landscapes. "You look radiant," she said, embracing me like I'd returned from battle rather than vacation. "I feel like I've been reborn," I told her, and meant it completely. Over dinner at a quiet restaurant, I told Margaret about Emma's call, Tyler's achievement, and Sarah's email. She listened with the wisdom of someone who'd watched me transform from victim to victor over the past year. "What does your gut tell you?" she asked finally. "My gut says my grandchildren need to see that people can change, that relationships can heal, but that healing requires accountability rather than just time passing. And your children? My children have lost something irreplaceable. The mother who would sacrifice anything for their comfort. Whether they're capable of appreciating the woman who replaced her remains to be seen." 2 weeks later, I agreed to meet my children at a neutral location, the same cafe where Sarah had first demanded I discuss my situation. But this time, I chose the table, I set the agenda, and I made it clear that this was their opportunity to demonstrate change rather than my obligation to provide it. They arrived together, looking nervous in a way I'd never seen before. Sarah wore less makeup than usual, Michael had lost weight, and Thomas looked older, as if the past year had forced them to confront realities they'd been avoiding. "Thank you for meeting with us," Sarah began, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "I'm here because Emma and Tyler deserve to have family relationships that aren't poisoned by financial manipulation," I said directly. "I'm not here to resume being your emergency fund or emotional safety net." For the next hour, they took turns attempting apologies that ranged from genuine remorse to continued rationalization. Sarah acknowledged that threatening conservatorship had been extreme. Michael admitted that expecting me to fund Tyler's activities had been presumptuous. Thomas confessed that moving across the country had been partly motivated by avoiding the guilt of not helping more with Richard's care. None of their apologies satisfied me completely, but I wasn't seeking perfect repentance. I was listening for evidence that they'd learned to see me as a person rather than a resource. "Here's what I'm willing to offer," I said finally. "Limited relationship, with clear boundaries. No financial discussions ever. No requests for money, loans, or gifts. No emotional manipulation involving the grandchildren. If you can demonstrate for 1 full year that you value me for something other than my bank account, we can reassess." "And the will?" Michael asked, unable to help himself. "The will stays exactly as it is. My money is mine to manage and distribute as I see fit. Your relationship with me is not an investment strategy." They agreed to my terms, though I could see the effort it required not to negotiate or argue. We parted with awkward hugs and tentative plans for Tyler's next soccer game, the first family event I'd been invited to as a spectator rather than a sponsor. As I drove home from that meeting, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. A year ago, I'd been a woman who measured her worth by her utility to others. Today, I was someone who understood that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was enablement disguised as devotion. My house welcomed me with silence that felt like peace rather than loneliness. My garden bloomed with flowers I'd planted for my own pleasure. My walls displayed paintings I'd created during moments of pure joy. I'd lost children who saw me as a financial resource, but I'd gained a relationship with grandchildren who were learning to love without conditions. I'd sacrificed relationships built on manipulation, but I'd discovered friendships founded on mutual respect and genuine affection. Most importantly, I'd found myself, not the person others needed me to be, but the woman I'd always been underneath layers of imposed obligation and inherited guilt. That evening, as I prepared dinner for one in a kitchen that belonged entirely to me, I raised a glass of wine to the woman in the mirror. A woman who'd finally learned that choosing herself wasn't selfish, it was revolutionary. Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where your value seemed tied to what you could provide, rather than who you are? Have you watched someone you love discover their worth after years of being taken for granted? Share your story in the comments below. And if this message resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because maybe there's someone else out there who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose yourself.